There's a specific kind of silence that only exists out on the water. It's not the absence of sound, exactly. It's more like the world is holding its breath. If you've spent any real time on a lake, especially the deep, glacial ones tucked away in the pockets of the Pacific Northwest or the dense woods of the North, you know the feeling. It's that moment when the engine cuts out, the wake finally settles, and you're left drifting in a space that feels like it wasn't meant for humans. I grew up on those waters. My grandfather had an old 1978 Boston Whaler, an unsinkable tug with a temperamental 70-horse Johnson outboard. He used to tell me that the water has a memory, and if you stay out long enough, it starts to share things it should have kept buried. Back then, I thought he was just trying to keep me from staying out past dark. Now, after what I saw 3 years ago on Lake Cillian, I realized he wasn't trying to scare me, he was trying to warn me. Lake Cillian isn't the kind of place you find on a postcard. It's deep, dark, and surrounded by timberland that hasn't seen a chainsaw in 50 years. My friend Mark and I had been planning this trip for months. We were in our late 20s, both of us bogged down by corporate jobs, and we needed that hit of nostalgia, the smell of two-stroke oil, the sting of cold spray on our faces, and the absolute freedom of an open throttle. We launched from a crumbling concrete ramp on the south end, just as the sun was beginning its slow descent. The plan was simple. Head to the Northern Fingers, a series of narrow, deep-water channels, find a quiet cove, and spend the night under the stars. The first few hours were perfect. The whaler hummed, cutting through the chop with that familiar, rhythmic times, thwack times of the hull hitting the waves. We talked about the old days, drank a few beers, and watched the shoreline transform from vibrant green to a haunting charcoal silhouette. By the time we reached the northern channels, the wind had died down completely. "Hey," Mark said, pointing toward a narrow inlet I didn't remember seeing on the topo map. "Let's check that out. Looks like it opens up into a lagoon." I looked at the map on my phone. There was nothing but solid green land where that inlet should be. I figured it was just high water or a recent shift in the shoreline, so I tilted the motor up a bit to avoid any submerged logs and eased the throttle forward. As we entered the channel, the temperature dropped. It wasn't just the evening chill. It was a physical wall of cold that seemed to radiate from the water itself. The trees on either side were massive ancient cedars with branches that draped down like weeping willow hair, almost touching the surface. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, though I didn't know why I was whispering. Mark shook his head. "Hear what?" "Exactly. Nothing." The birds had stopped. The frogs, which usually created a deafening chorus this time of year, were silent. Even the sound of our own wake hitting the muddy banks seemed muffled, as if the air itself was thick, like velvet. We rounded a sharp bend, and the channel opened into a perfectly circular pool of water, maybe 100 yards across. In the center of the pool sat another boat. It was an old wooden Chris-craft, the kind with the beautiful mahogany deck and chrome fittings. It looked pristine, glowing strangely in the twilight, but it was sitting dead still in the water. No anchor line, no lights, no movement. "Hello?" Mark called out. His voice didn't echo. It just died, like the sound was being sucked into the trees. There was no response. As we drifted closer, I noticed something that made the hair on my arm stand up. The Chris-craft didn't have a registration number on the bow. It didn't even have a name. It was just a blank, polished shell. "Maybe they're in trouble," Mark said, his hand reaching for the boat hook. I put the whaler in neutral. We were about 20 feet away now. I could see into the cockpit of the other boat. There were two figures sitting in the back, a man and a woman. They were dressed in what looked like Sunday best from the 1950s. The man had a sharp fedora tilted low over his eyes, and the woman wore a floral dress with a white cardigan. They weren't moving. They weren't even breathing. They were staring straight ahead toward the far bank of the lagoon. "Hey, you guys okay?" I shouted, my heart hammering against my ribs. The man slowly, and I mean with a mechanical, agonizing slowness, turned his head toward us, but his body stayed perfectly still. He turned his neck further than a human should be able to, until he was looking directly at me over his shoulder. Under the brim of that hat, there was nothing. No eyes, No nose, no mouth, just a smooth, pale surface that looked like wet clay. I didn't wait for Mark to say a word. I slammed the throttle into reverse, the engine screaming as it fought to pull us away from that thing. As the whaler swung around, I looked back one last time. The Chris craft wasn't there anymore. There were no ripples, no sound of a sinking hull. The water was as flat and black as a sheet of obsidian. The lagoon was empty. We didn't stop until we hit the main lake, and even then, we didn't stay. We hauled the boat out in the dark, the trailer tires screeching on the pavement as we sped away. I sold that whaler 2 weeks later. People ask me why I don't go out on the water anymore, and I usually just tell them I got bored of it. But sometimes, when I'm trying to sleep, I can still feel that cold wall of air. I think about that lagoon, and I wonder, if we had gotten any closer, would we have become part of that memory too? Just two more figures sitting in a boat that doesn't exist, waiting for the next person to wander off the map. That experience changed the way I look at every body of water. I started researching Lake Cillian. Looking through old microfilms at the local library, I found a clipping from 1954. A local couple had gone out for a sunset cruise in their brand new Chris craft and never returned. The boat was never found. No debris, no oil slick, nothing. The headline read, "The lake claims two more." The thing is, I'm not the only one with a story like this. Once you start looking, you realize the water is full of holes, places where the real world thins out, and something else, something older and much less friendly peeks through. Take my friend Sarah's experience. She worked as a dockhand at a high-end marina on Lake Tahoe for 3 summers. Tahoe is famous for its clarity, but it's also famous for its depth. Over 1,000 feet of freezing water that never gives up its dead. Sarah was a skeptic. She didn't believe in ghosts or lake monsters. She believed in physics, diesel engines, and the steady rhythm of the tides, until the night of the silent yacht. It was a Tuesday in late August, around 2 a.m. A thick fog had rolled in off the Sierras, turning the marina into a ghostly maze of creaking timber and clinking rigging. Sarah was doing her final rounds, checking the lines on the multi-million-dollar cruisers moored in the outer slips. She told me she smelled it before she saw it. A smell of old, stagnant pond water and rotting lilies, completely out of place in the crisp, alpine air of Tahoe. Then she heard the sound. A soft, rhythmic, thumping, thump, 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 like a heavy rope hitting a fiberglass hull. She turned her flashlight toward the end of Pier 7. A massive, sleek, white yacht was pulling into the slip, but there was no engine noise, no bow thruster. It was moving through the water with an impossible, ghostly momentum. "Can I help you with your lines?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling slightly. The yacht didn't slow down. It glided into the slip with surgical precision. As Sarah stepped closer to catch the lead line, she realized the boat was covered in deep-sea kelp. Long, slimy strands of green and brown draped over the railings, trailing into the water. But Tahoe doesn't have kelp. It's a freshwater lake. She looked up at the flybridge. Standing at the helm was a figure in a yellow slicker. The hood was up, shadowing the face. The figure didn't look at her. It just stood there, hands on the wheel, staring out into the fog. Sarah reached out to grab the line that was hanging over the side. As her fingers brushed the rope, she said it felt like ice so cold it burned her skin. "Sir?" she asked, her flashlight beam hitting the figure's hands. The hands weren't hands. They were pale, bloated things, with long, spindly fingers that seemed to have too many joints. They were fused to the steering wheel, the skin overgrown around the metal like a tree growing around a fence. Sarah backed away, her heart hammering. She tripped over a cleat and fell hard on the wooden planks. When she looked up, the slip was empty. The yacht was gone. There were no wet spots on the dock, no smell of rot, no lingering wake. Just the fog and the sound of the distant buoy bell. She quit the next day. She told the manager she was moving back inland, away from the water. He didn't even act surprised. He just nodded, handed her her final check, and said, "Sometimes the deep ones come up for a breath. Best not to be standing there when they do." I've spent a lot of time thinking about Sarah's story, and my own. Is it possible that these lakes are more than just geographical features? Could they be doorways? Think about the sheer volume of what we don't know about the water. We've mapped the surface of Mars better than we've mapped our own lake beds. Down there, in the dark, in the pressure, time might not work the same way. Maybe those people in the Chris Craft aren't dead. Maybe they're just stuck, caught in a loop of a perfect evening that turned into an eternal nightmare. And then there are the stories that don't involve ghosts. Sometimes the horror is much more physical, much more hungry. I want to tell you about the third story, something that happened to a group of divers at a flooded quarry in Kentucky. But before we get to that, I want you to think about the last time you were swimming in a lake. That moment when you felt something cold brush against your ankle. You told yourself it was just seaweed. You told yourself it was just a fish. But deep down, in that primal part of your brain, did you really believe that? I spent my 20s chasing that feeling. That specific heavy silence you can only find when you're 40 feet below the surface of the water, where the sun is just a shimmering distant memory and the only thing you can hear is the rhythmic, metallic times, hiss-whoosh times of your own breathing. In Kentucky, we have these places called blue holes. They're old limestone or marble quarries that hit the water table and flooded almost overnight. The water in them is a surreal, crystalline turquoise on a sunny day, but as soon as you dip below the surface, that beauty turns into something much more clinical, much more unforgiving. Back in the summer of 2014, my buddies Leo, Sam, and I found a spot that wasn't on any of the local diving maps. It was on private land, tucked behind a screen of weeping willows and jagged rock face about an hour outside of Lexington. The locals called it the Golgotha Pit, which probably should have been our first warning. But when you're 24 and you've got a brand new set of Scuba Pro regulators, you feel invincible. The setup was perfect. It was one of those oppressive Kentucky July days where the humidity feels like a wet wool blanket. We hauled our gear through the brush, sweating through our shirts, until we saw it. The quarry was a perfect circle, maybe 200 yards across. The walls were sheer limestone, bleached bone white by the sun, dropping straight into water so still it looked like a sheet of dark glass. We spent the afternoon doing shallow dives, 30, maybe 40 feet. It was nostalgic, honestly. It reminded me of being a kid, jumping off the docks at Lake Cumberland, that feeling of total weightless freedom. We found old rusted mining equipment, a crane arm sticking out of the silt like a skeletal finger, a few ore carts that looked like they were waiting for a ghost crew to come back to work. But as the sun started to dip behind the tree line, casting long, jagged shadows across the water, the mood shifted. Leo, who was always the most adventurous of us, pointed to a dark smudge on the far wall, about 60 feet down. He thought it was the entrance to a submerged cavern. In the diving world, unmapped cavern is a siren song. We decided to do one last deep dive before packing up. As we descended, the temperature plummeted. We hit the thermocline, that sharp boundary where the warm surface water meets the icy depths. It felt like stepping into a meat locker. The light turned from a friendly teal to a bruised, sickly purple. At 60 feet, we found the opening. It wasn't a cave. It was a tunnel, perfectly rectangular, clearly man-made. It led straight into the heart of the limestone wall. I checked my pressure gauge. We had plenty of air, but a cold knot started to form in my stomach. You see, sound travels 4 times faster underwater than it does in the air. You don't just hear sounds, you feel them in your chest. And as we hovered at the mouth of that dark rectangle, I felt a vibration. It wasn't the steady hum of a boat motor or the clatter of a distant pump. It was a low, organic times thrum, like a giant cat purring. Leo signaled with his dive light times. Should we go in? Sam shook his head, but Leo was already kicking forward. In a quarry, silt is your worst enemy. One wrong kick, and the visibility goes from 20 feet to 0 in a second. We followed him, keeping our movements tight. Inside, the tunnel was lined with old timber supports. They were covered in a thick gray slime that swayed in the wake of our fins. It looked like hair, long, pale hair. Then, the off details started to accumulate. First, it was the fish. Or rather, the lack of them. In these quarries, you usually see bluegill or the occasional lost catfish. But here, Nothing. Not even a crawdad. Second, it was the smell. Now, I know what you're thinking. How can you smell anything through a regulator? But you can. You taste the air from your tank, and sometimes, if there's something powerful enough in the water, a hint of it seeps into your sinuses. The water started to taste metallic, like pennies and rotted meat. We reached the end of the tunnel after about 50 feet. It opened up into a massive submerged chamber. Our lights couldn't even find the far wall. It was just a vast, empty blackness. Leo swam out into the center of the void, his light cutting a lonely path through the dark. I watched his silhouette, a small, fragile thing against the infinite deep. Suddenly, he stopped. He went completely still. He turned his light downward. I swam up beside him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked down, and for a second, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The floor of the chamber wasn't rock. It was a mound, a massive, undulating pile of something. It was white, translucent, and it seemed to be breathing. As I got closer, the silt on top of it shifted, and I realized with a jolt of pure, ice-cold adrenaline that it wasn't silt at all. It was bones. Thousands of them. Small ones, large ones, deer skeletons, canine skulls, and things that looked disturbingly like human femurs, all picked clean and polished to a shine by the water. And then, the mound moved. It didn't just shift, it times uncoiled. A section of the white mass, easily 20 feet long, rose up from the floor. It didn't have scales. It didn't have fins. It looked like a giant, pale muscle, thick as a tree trunk, ending in a head that was mostly just a gaping, circular maw lined with rows of needle-like teeth. It didn't have eyes. It didn't need them. It felt us. I didn't think. I grabbed Leo's BC vest and Sam's arm, and I kicked. I kicked harder than I ever have in my life. We weren't supposed to ascend that fast. We risked the bends, the nitrogen bubbles screaming in our blood, but the alternative was so much worse. I looked back once. In the beam of my falling flashlight, I saw the thing. It wasn't just one. There were dozens of them, pale and blind, rising from the bone pile like a forest of hungry ghosts. They didn't swim like fish. They moved like snakes, sensing the vibrations of our panicked hearts. One of them brushed against my fin. It wasn't slimy. It was rough, like sandpaper. It felt hungry. Not like a predator hunting for food, but like a vacuum, a void that wanted to pull everything into itself. We breached the surface, gasping, screaming, scrambling over the jagged limestone until our hands were bloody. We didn't even stop to take off our tanks. We just ran for the truck, the heavy gear banging against our backs, the taste of pennies still thick in our mouths. We never went back. A month later, we heard that the land had been bought by a private security firm, and the entire quarry was surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with razor wire. No signs, no explanation, just a gate and a lock. I still live in Kentucky. I still go to the lakes, but I don't dive in quarries anymore, because I know what's at the bottom of them. I know that when the earth gets scarred that deep, sometimes things from the dark ages of the world crawl into the wounds and stay there. Sometimes, I lie awake at night, and I think about that pile of bones. I think about how many of those missing persons cases you see on the news. The ones where a car is found near a body of water, but the driver is gone, end up at the bottom of a blue hole. Am I overthinking this? Maybe it was just a colony of overgrown, mutated eels. Maybe the bones were just uniquely shaped limestone deposits. That's what I try to tell myself when I'm staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. But then I remember the vibration, the purr, the feeling of that rough, cold muscle brushing against my foot. What do you think? Have you ever felt something down there? Something that didn't just want to scare you, but wanted to consume you? Next time you're out on the water, and you see a spot where the surface is just a little too still, a little too dark, do yourself a favor. Don't look down, because something down there might be looking back up at you.